Imagine a Yorkshire morning veiled in mist, a grave still fresh, and a farm girl with soot on her hands and steel in her spine. The land that raised Tessa Bramble is taken in a single stroke of ink, and duty drives her through Wrenwood's iron gates, into a house of polished silence and watchful eyes. In the shadows stands a butler whose gaze feels too knowing, as if the walls themselves guard a name he dare not speak. A secret gathers like thunder. A choice sharpens like a blade, survival or dignity, duty or desire. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from, and what do you love most about Victorian romances? Your answers bring this world to life. Yorkshire, England, late spring of 1864. The land was damp with morning. A thin veil of mist clung to the moors, curling around the edge of the Bramble farm like a final whisper of farewell. The funeral had been simple, just a handful of neighbours, a minister with shaking hands, and Tessa Bramble standing alone at the grave with her father's old cap clenched between her fingers. She did not cry. The tears had come and gone in the silent nights before, and now there was only the heavy quiet of goodbye. The wind carried the scent of wet soil and faded heather, a scent she had known since childhood. But nothing about this moment felt familiar. Not the sharp black dress borrowed from Mrs. Corbin down the lane, nor the boots that pinched at her heels, nor the way Mr. Hale, the land steward, refused to meet her gaze as he read from the papers in his gloved hands. Papers that declared the Bramble property no longer hers. That the creditor, some gentleman from the south with investments and influence, had taken possession of her father's land in full, claiming unpaid debts with the cold clarity of ink and signature. The barn, the fences, the orchard where she used to pick apples, gone. Miss Bramble, Mr. Hale said awkwardly, as if the word miss still meant something. You are instructed to report to Wrenwood Hall before dusk. A position has been secured for you. She had heard the name before. Wrenwood Hall loomed over the valley from its hill of stone and secrets. She had never seen it up close. As a girl, she imagined it housed noblemen and silver tea sets and tall windows that never opened. Now it stood as her sentence. Tessa lowered her chin, pressed her lips together, and gave a single nod. She would not beg. She would not plead. If the world had decided she was worth nothing more than service, then she would serve with her spine straight and her eyes clear. The cart ride from the farm to the manor was long and rattling. She clutched her satchel tightly, its contents no more than a shift, a ribbon, and her mother's thimble wrapped in cloth. The fields she passed blurred in hues of green and brown, the sky as pale as milk. She did not speak. The driver, a tight-lipped man who smelled of smoke and starch, said nothing either. Only when the iron gates of Wrenwood creaked open did she feel the full weight of where she was going. The house was vast, grey stone, ivy-clad walls, and windows that did not smile. It was the kind of house that remembered things, griefs, betrayals, the echo of footsteps no longer heard. Its towers pierced the sky, and its great oak doors seemed carved not for welcome, but for warning. Inside, the air was colder. The scent of polish and wax drifted through the halls. Tessa's boots clicked on the flagged stone floor, too loud, too raw. She was led wordlessly by a maid in a crisp apron through a labyrinth of passageways until she was brought to the servants' hall. There, standing like a fortress in bombazine and keys, was Mrs. Pell. "Miss Bramble," the housekeeper said, her voice clipped and low, "you will report to the kitchens at 5 o'clock sharp. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will not linger. You will be grateful." Tessa met the woman's eyes, not defiantly, but not with submission either. "I understand," she said softly. Behind her, someone gave a quiet snort. A man leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. He was tall, lean, with blonde hair slicked back, and a smirk curled at the edge of his mouth. "Edgar Pike," he said, bowing low in mock welcome, "footman and occasional collector of strays." "Enough, Pike," came a voice from behind him. Not loud, not angry, but still, it silenced the room like the closing of a ledger. He stepped aside, and there, stepping into view with deliberate grace, was the butler, Mr. Nathaniel Ward. He was unlike the others, not just in posture or dress, though his black coat was immaculate, his white shirt stark against the dusky shadows, but in presence. He did not move like a servant. He moved like a man who had measured the space and decided it would not master him. His face was pale, sharply drawn, with eyes the color of iron and lips that neither frowned nor smiled. For a breathless second, those eyes met hers. And in that silence, so brief, so quiet, something passed between them. Not warmth, not hostility. Something else, something watchful. As if he could see not just her posture, her satchel, her smudged boots, but the hunger she carried beneath her ribs. The hunger not for bread or rest, but for dignity. "You'll be assigned to the lower scullery," he said, turning to Mrs. Pell. "Let cook know she's arrived." "Yes, Mr. Ward," the housekeeper replied immediately. He did not glance at Tessa again. He turned and walked away, his footsteps soft, measured, final. The great hall swallowed him. That evening, Tessa scrubbed floors with ash-bitten hands. She peeled potatoes until her knuckles ached. She listened to the clatter of pans, the ring of bells, the murmur of voices upstairs, speaking a language of wealth she had never been taught. But even as her apron grew stained and her shoulders sagged, something within her remained untouched. She had seen the inside of the lion's den, and though she wore its collar, she would not lower her gaze. Not yet. Not ever. The first days at Wrenwood Hall passed not in hours, but in endless tasks that blurred together like strokes of soot upon stone. Before dawn, Tessa rose to the sound of the kitchen bell. The air in the scullery was always damp and cold, smelling of soap, smoke, and onions. Her hands were raw, her fingers nicked from scrubbing copper pots until she could see her own weary reflection in them. Each movement had to be precise, timed, unseen. Servants were not meant to exist in silence. They were the silence. Mrs. Pell's footsteps echoed down the corridor, and every sound in the kitchen froze. The housekeeper swept through like an autumn gust, checking corners, scolding those who failed to bow fast enough. Her keys clinked like judgment. "You will remember, Miss Bramble," she said one morning. "The only way to remain invisible is to work as if you were made of air." Tessa nodded, though her pride trembled under the weight of obedience. Invisible. The word struck her more deeply than the chill of the flagstone floor. She had come from open fields, from skies wide and generous. Now her world had narrowed to the circumference of a basin and the small patch of light that fell from the kitchen window each morning. The kitchen itself was a small kingdom ruled by cook, a stout woman with arms like rolling pins and a temper that sizzled louder than her pans. Tessa learned quickly. Keep her head down, her mouth shut and her pace steady. When Edgar Pike brought in deliveries, he took every chance to linger, offering remarks disguised as kindness. "You've got nimble hands for a farmer's girl," he told her once, leaning too close as she reached for a bundle of carrots. "One might think you were bred for finer things." Tessa kept her eyes on the cutting board. "Hands were made for work, not display," she replied softly. His smirk deepened. "So were eyes, Miss Bramble. Best you learn not to use yours so much." Before Tessa could speak, a quiet voice interrupted. "Mr. Pike." Edgar straightened immediately. Nathaniel Ward stood at the threshold, his black coat immaculate, his expression unreadable. He held a letter in one hand, his posture effortlessly composed. There was no anger in his voice, only stillness, the kind that demanded obedience. "You may leave the kitchen now. I believe the front hall still requires your attention." Edgar hesitated. "Yes, sir." He turned, offering Tessa a glare as sharp as a blade before disappearing through the door. Nathaniel's eyes lingered on the girl for an instant. "Miss Bramble," he said quietly, "I trust you are settling into your duties." She swallowed hard. "Yes, Mr. Ward." "Good." He inclined his head. "Do remember, at Wrenwood, one need not defend oneself. Work speaks louder than words. His tone held no reproach, yet the advice felt personal, almost protective. And before she could answer, he was gone again, his measured steps fading down the corridor like the echo of restraint. That night, Tessa could not sleep. The servants' quarters were narrow, their ceilings low. Rain tapped against the window pane as she lay awake, staring into the dark. The image of Mr. Ward's gaze haunted her, steady, assessing, not cruel yet impossible to decipher. It was as if he carried an entire story behind those iron blue eyes, and every time he looked at her, a page turned silently. The following week tested her in new ways. The rhythm of service was relentless, polishing the silver, laundering table linens until her knuckles bled, fetching coal for the scullery stove. And yet, no matter how harsh the task, Tessa sensed she was being watched, not with suspicion, but with a quiet attention that unsettled her more than hostility ever could. One morning, while carrying a tray of tea up the back staircase, she slipped on a loose tile. The tray clattered, the teacups shattered, and hot tea burned across her wrist. She gasped, more in fear of Mrs. Pell's wrath than in pain. But before she could kneel to gather the fragments, a shadow appeared beside her. "Don't move!" Nathaniel knelt, his gloved hands deftly picking up the shards. He examined her wrist, his touch precise, careful, yet electric in its restraint. "It's only a scald," he murmured, removing his glove to dab at her skin with a handkerchief. "You'll manage." Their eyes met briefly. His voice was calm, but his hand lingered just a heartbeat too long. She could feel the warmth of his skin through the fine cloth. Then, as if realizing the danger of the moment, he rose swiftly, tucking the handkerchief back into his pocket. "Return to your post, Miss Bramble." She did. But that night, alone by the small hearth, she remembered the feel of his hand and hated herself for it. It was 2 days later when the fire broke out. It began with the smell of smoke, sharp and sudden, followed by Cook's cry from the kitchen. A cloth left too close to the flame had caught, and within moments the lower shelves were ablaze. Chaos filled the air. Servants shouted, buckets clanged, and Tessa, acting on instinct, grabbed the nearest jug of water and threw it onto the fire. The flames hissed, but spread along the grease-stained counter. In her panic, she saw a small box on the sideboard, old, wooden, marked with dust and wax seals. She seized it just before the shelves above it collapsed. When the last ember was smothered and the air stank of smoke and fear, the servants stood in trembling silence. Mrs. Pell's fury was palpable. "Whose fault was this?" she demanded. No one spoke. Tessa clutched the box to her chest, its lid scorched, its brass clasp warped by heat. "Miss Bramble," Mrs. Pell snapped, "why are you holding that? I thought it might burn." Before the housekeeper could answer, Mr. Ward appeared at the door, his expression carved in calm authority. "She did right," he said simply. "That box contains estate ledgers from before the late master's passing. Had they been lost, the damage would be far worse than a few scorched shelves." Mrs. Pell stiffened. "Yes, Mr. Ward. Have the kitchen scrubbed and aired by morning." His gaze shifted briefly to Tessa. "You will bring the box to my office before the hour is out." She nodded, heart pounding. When she arrived, the butler's office was dimly lit, the fire casting long shadows across the panelled walls. The scent of ink and wax filled the air. He stood by the desk, sleeves rolled to his forearms, examining one of the charred corners of the box. "You have a steady hand in a crisis," he said after a moment. "Most freeze or flee." "I did neither," Tessa replied. "No, you did not." He looked up at her then, the faintest trace of something, approval, gratitude in his eyes. "You may return to your duties." As she turned to leave, his voice stopped her once more. "Miss Bramble." She faced him. "There is no shame in caution," he said quietly, "but sometimes silence can be just as dangerous as recklessness." The meaning was unclear, yet it settled in her mind like an echo she would hear long after. That evening, while wiping soot from the kitchen shelves, she noticed Edgar watching her again, his eyes narrow and glinting. "Saved the day, did you?" he murmured. "Strange how quick you are to please the butler." Tessa ignored him, though a flush crept into her cheeks. He laughed softly, cruelly. "Careful, farm girl, some fires are better left to die on their own." When he left, she stood frozen, the rag limp in her hand. Above her, the walls groaned with the night wind, and somewhere down the hall she heard the faint ticking of a clock, steady, controlled, merciless. The next night, the manor slept beneath a moon the colour of pewter. Tessa rose to fetch water from the courtyard pump. Passing the study near the butler's office, she paused. Voices murmured beyond the half-closed door. "I have the papers ready, Mr. Ward," said a man she did not recognize, perhaps the land agent by his accent. "But if Lord Lionel continues to contest the deed, there may be further complications. He means to claim Wrenwood through his mother's line." Nathaniel's voice, low and steady, answered, "He may claim what he likes. The law will see what it chooses. Until then, the estate remains under my care. And the servants, if they discover, they will not." Tessa's breath caught. A soft scrape of a chair followed, and she stepped back into the shadows, heart hammering. She could not make sense of the words, but she knew enough to feel the chill of danger behind them. When the door opened a moment later, Nathaniel appeared in the corridor, his expression composed but distant, the faintest trace of fatigue softening the lines of his face. He paused when he saw her. "Could you not sleep?" She clutched her pail. "I was fetching water, sir." "Then fetch it," he said gently, and passed her by. But his gaze lingered for an instant, long enough that she felt the air tighten around them, long enough for her to sense that he knew she had heard. Later, as she returned to her narrow bed, she lay awake, listening to the wind brushing the shutters, her mind a storm of questions. Who was Lord Lionel? What claim could there be upon a house already so heavy with its own ghosts? And who, beneath the perfect composure of that black coat, was Mr. Nathaniel Ward truly protecting? The candle beside her flickered once, then went out, leaving her in darkness and silence. But even in the quiet, his voice lingered in her thoughts, low, restrained, and filled with secrets she was not yet meant to know. The dawn came late and sullen to Wrenwood Hall, blanketing the stone corridors with a fog that lingered like an unshed tear. Rain had fallen in the night, and the damp had crept into the walls, settling in the joints of the old house like sorrow made physical. Tessa Bramble, rising before the bells, felt the chill in her bones as she lit the scullery hearth, her fingers trembling slightly over the flint. The day began with little ceremony, bread to knead, floors to scrub, ash to haul. The routine held her body, but her thoughts were elsewhere, trapped in the memory of a half-heard conversation beyond the study door. Words about deeds, claims, rightful heirs, and above all that voice, Mr. Ward's voice, stripped of the usual stillness, shadowed with something deeper, something that felt like grief or defiance. She had not told anyone what she'd heard, not Millie, not Mrs. Pell, and certainly not the man himself. But the knowledge lived inside her now, a restless thing. It was not until the next morning that her steps took her, as if summoned, toward the study. The east wing of the manor was hushed at that hour. Light spilled faintly through the high-arched windows, catching on dust motes that danced like suspended secrets. The study door, tall, dark, carved with the Wren family crest, stood closed. No key on her ring would fit its lock, but today it had been left ajar. A careless error or an invitation? She hesitated. The silence was complete. The opportunity, fleeting. Tessa stepped inside. The air within was warmer than expected, fragrant with beeswax and old vellum. Heavy curtains were drawn back, allowing the weak morning sun to fall across the desk and bookshelves. Every surface was ordered with the precision of a man who feared chaos. Leather-bound volumes lined the walls, framed sketches of the estate in winter, in blossom, in storm. A clock ticked softly, and there, propped carefully against a stack of ledgers, was a portrait. She moved closer, breath caught in her throat. The painting was small, clearly commissioned in another decade. A young man stood in profile, dressed in the tailored simplicity of a country gentleman. Chestnut brown hair, straight nose, high cheekbones, a mouth drawn in dignity. But it was the eyes that struck her, steel blue, steady, watchful. She had seen those eyes before, every day, Mr. Nathaniel Ward. Except this man was not in livery. He was not bound by gloves or silence. He was standing as master, not servant. Her gaze drifted down to the desk. A box lay open, its contents orderly but aged. Letters tied in ribbon, parchment cracked with time. One envelope had been drawn forward, as if meant to be read. The handwriting was elegant, though faded. "To my son, Nathaniel Harrow Wren." Her hand hovered above it, but did not touch. She had seen enough. Tessa stumbled backward, the breath leaving her body in a rush. The truth was no longer a question, it was a certainty. The butler was no butler. She left the room as silently as she had entered, closing the door with trembling hands. All day she worked in a daze. She burned her palm on a skillet, forgot the flour in the bread, dropped a stack of clean linens. Mrs. Pell noticed, but said nothing. Only Mr. Ward, passing her in the corridor, seemed to pause. His gaze lingered just a second too long, and her heart stuttered under its weight. That evening, after supper was cleared and the hearth dimmed to embers, Tessa found herself in the still room. It was the only place in the house where she felt unseen, untouched. Dried herbs hung from the beams. The scent of lavender, thyme, and candle wax wrapped her like a shawl. She sat at the small table and took out a scrap of writing paper. A single candle flickered at her elbow. The pen in her hand trembled as she dipped it into the inkwell. "Reverend Ainsley," she began, her handwriting uneven, "forgive my boldness, but I find myself burdened with a truth too large to bear alone. I have reason to believe that Mr. Nathaniel Ward is not who he claims to be. I have seen documents that suggest he is the rightful heir to Wrenwood Hall." She stopped. The ink blotted. Her hand ached. Outside the still-room door, a clock struck 11. Tessa stared at the letter, her thoughts warring with themselves. Was it betrayal to speak what she knew, or betrayal to keep silent when the entire house operated under a falsehood? She imagined Mrs. Pell's face, stern and worn, but fair. Millie's laughter in the kitchen, Lady Althea's silence at the breakfast table. All of them lived within the structure Mr. Ward upheld. A lie, perhaps, but a lie that kept them warm, fed, protected. And him, Mr. Ward, Nathaniel. She could not even think the name without her throat tightening. What right had she to shatter the careful scaffolding he had built around himself? She stared at the letter, then slowly she reached for the small brass candle snuffer. The flame died. She held the page to the ember at the hearth. It caught, curled, blackened. She watched the words disappear into smoke. By the time she returned to her cot that night, her hands smelled faintly of ash. The next morning, Mrs. Pell informed her that she would be helping organize the linen inventory in the West Wing. It was a dusty, thankless task, but the silence was welcome. She folded sheets, counted pillowcases, repaired frayed edges. Midday light poured through the narrow windows, and for a few blessed hours the world returned to the simplicity of cloth and thread. She had just begun refolding a stack of curtains when a voice startled her. "You work quickly." She turned. Mr. Ward stood in the doorway, hands behind his back as always. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were not. Steel blue, knowing. "I try," she replied, forcing composure into her tone. He stepped inside, glancing at the neat piles. "You've done more in one morning than some manage in 3. She busied herself with the folds. "I was taught not to linger where I'm not wanted." A pause. Then quietly, "And yet sometimes the places where we are least expected become the ones we understand best." She stilled. There it was again, That barely veiled message, that invitation to speak and warning not to. She turned toward him finally. If a person carries a truth that doesn't belong to them, Mr. Ward, what should they do with it? He looked at her for a long moment. The air between them tightened. That depends, he said softly. Is it a truth that would free others or only bind them more deeply? Her breath caught. Her hands were damp. She gave a small nod, barely perceptible. Nathaniel inclined his head and turned to go. At the door he paused once more. Some things, he said, are best protected by silence, and some, Miss Bramble, by trust. He left without another word. And Tessa, standing alone amid towers of folded linen, realized something she had not before. That silence, when chosen freely, was not weakness. It was devotion. The sky over Yorkshire darkened with a quiet ferocity. Clouds, heavy and slate-coloured, gathered with slow menace above the hills, casting long shadows across the valley. Wrenwood Hall stood unmoved, tall and grey, its towers rising like sentinels against the churning heavens, but far below, in the lowland fields and tenant cottages, unease was already mounting. The river had begun to swell. By the hour of 4, the wind had risen, and the first crack of thunder rolled across the moors with the solemnity of a war drum. Rain followed, swift and merciless, battering the glass panes of the manor and sweeping through the grounds in cold sheets. Inside the kitchens, the servants braced for another long night, windows latched, hearths tended, blankets folded for any upper-floor guest caught unprepared by the weather. But Tessa's mind was not inside the walls of Wrenwood. She had heard the message from the stable boy. One of the Carter children had been swept into the mire, and the cowshed behind the Mowbray cottage was on the verge of collapse. The families who lived near the riverbank were already gathering what little they could, herding livestock, carrying infants, dragging sacks of oats and grain to higher ground. No orders had been given, no permission granted. But Tessa did not wait. She shed her apron, tied her cloak tightly at the throat, and slipped out through the scullery door into the driving rain. The path toward the tenant farms had turned to mud within minutes. Water rushed in small rivers down the hillside. The lantern she carried flickered against the wind, its flame barely clinging to life. She held it close, stumbling through the deepening dark, her boots sinking with every step. Her skirts were soaked within moments, clinging to her legs like cold skin. But she pressed on. Voices shouted ahead, frantic, muffled by the storm. She reached the first fence post just as 2 boys passed a squirming lamb over the rails, their eyes wide with fear. "Miss Bramble," one of them cried, startled. "You shouldn't be here." "I'm not here to watch," she called back, breathless. "Where's your mother?" "In the shed, with the baby. The roof's breaking." She didn't hesitate. Climbing the gate, she ran toward the collapsing structure, her feet sliding in the sludge. The sound of groaning wood reached her ears, followed by a cry from inside. "Tessa!" a woman's voice gasped. "I'm here!" she shouted, crouching to enter through the half-open door. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp hay and animal fear. Mrs. Mowbray clutched her infant to her chest, water trickling down her face. A calf moaned from the corner. The beams above were sagging. Tessa took the child in her arms and guided the woman out, shielding them with her own body as the door banged in the wind. Once they were safely in the cart that waited beyond the rise, she turned back to the others. She could not stop. Others still needed help. It was then she heard his voice. "Tessa!" She turned, stunned, the rain stinging her face. Mr. Ward stood at the crest of the hill, drenched from head to foot, his coat plastered to his tall frame, hair darkened to near black, eyes blazing with something that looked perilously close to anguish. She opened her mouth to speak, but before a word escaped, he had descended the slope and was beside her. "You'll catch your death," he said, his tone low and furious. "They needed help." "I know. That's why I came." They stood in silence, both breathing hard, water dripping from their clothes. The moment held. It expanded between them with each pulse of thunder, with each glance that lingered just a moment too long. Then he turned. "There are more cottages below. Come." They moved as one. Together they worked through the storm, guiding frightened families to safety, lifting heavy crates, tethering cows to trees. Once Nathaniel pulled a boy from a flooded ditch, his coat torn and hands bloodied from the struggle. Tessa wrapped the child in her cloak and carried him until they reached the chapel's high steps. They did not speak much, but every gesture between them spoke volumes. When she stumbled, he caught her elbow without hesitation. When his hand trembled from the cold, she pressed a dry cloth into his palm. The space between them had changed. It was no longer guarded by silence. It was held together by something quieter and stronger. By the time the last family had been settled, the storm had begun to ease. The wind died down to a whistle. The rain softened to a whisper. And Tessa, soaked to the skin and shivering, turned back toward the manor, Nathaniel walking beside her, both too exhausted to think of explanations. When they entered through the servants' entrance, Mrs. Pell was already waiting. Her arms crossed, her mouth a tight line. She looked from one to the other and said nothing, but her silence carried a warning. The next morning, Tessa was summoned. She stood in the narrow antechamber outside the butler's office, hands clasped, hair still damp at the nape. Her heart beat with the rhythm of dread. The hall felt colder than usual. The sky outside was pale and silent, as though nothing had happened at all. Mrs. Pell emerged first, looking grim. "You'll speak with the master now." But before Tessa could step forward, Mr. Ward's voice rose from within. "There is no need." Mrs. Pell paused, her brow furrowing. "Sir, I've already dealt with the matter. Miss Bramble was acting under my instruction." Tessa's head snapped up. Mrs. Pell blinked. "Your instruction?" "She was delivering a message on my behalf when the weather worsened. I failed to give her proper escort. The responsibility lies with me." The housekeeper studied him for a long moment. Then, with a nod, she turned away. "As you say, Mr. Ward." Tessa entered the office quietly. Nathaniel stood behind the desk, one hand resting on the windowsill. He did not look at her at first. "You took great risk," he said finally, his voice low. "The estate cannot afford to lose its servants to the river." She stepped closer. "You took the same risk." He turned to face her. There was something raw in his expression, something unguarded. "I have the luxury of doing so. You do not." "I don't see it that way." His gaze searched hers, deep and steady. "You could have told them the truth," she whispered. "You didn't have to lie for me." "I didn't," he replied quietly. "I lied for myself." The words hung between them, heavier than the storm clouds had been. He moved toward her then, slowly, deliberately, until only the breadth of the hearth lay between them. "In the still room," he said, his voice softer now. "You asked what should be done with a truth too large to bear. I believe I understand your question more clearly now." Her breath caught. He held her gaze. "Sometimes, Miss Bramble, truth must wait until those who carry it are strong enough to hold it without breaking." The quiet between them was profound. Tessa did not speak, but her eyes shone with something that shimmered. Respect, sorrow, something almost tender. Then he turned, and the spell broke. "You are dismissed," he said, though his tone was gentle. She left the office slowly, her heart both heavier and lighter than before. At the end of the corridor, behind the half-closed door to the lower pantry, a pair of eyes watched her go. Edgar Pike smiled to himself, a slow, curling smile that held no warmth, and the silence of Wrenwood held its breath. The first sign of Mr. Lionel Wren's arrival was not his carriage, but the unsettling quiet that fell over the house before its wheels ever touched the gravel drive. Lady Althea had received the letter a week prior, an elegant hand upon thick vellum, announcing the visit with the cordial formality of family obligation. But no one in the servant halls mistook it for anything other than what it was, a disruption. On the morning of his arrival, every room was scrubbed twice, the brass polished to a gleam, and the linen in the guest chambers replaced with lace-trimmed sheets rarely removed from their linen-wrapped drawer. Lady Althea herself summoned Mrs. Pell 3 times, her tone increasingly clipped. By noon the house stood waiting, silent, stiff. Then came the carriage, painted a glossy navy with wheels that cut arrogantly through the gravel as if it owned the path. 2 footmen in matching livery descended first, followed by a valet, and finally the man himself, Mr. Lionel Wren. He was tall and lean, with golden brown hair brushed back with oil and an expression carved from self-satisfaction. His walking stick clicked deliberately as he climbed the front steps, his gloved hand resting on the iron banister as though to test its worth. The staff, lined in respectful stillness in the vestibule, lowered their gazes as he passed. But Tessa, standing at the back, dared a glance. He was handsome in the way a fox is handsome, refined, sleek, and dangerous if cornered. His mouth held the trace of a smile that never reached the eyes. Lady Althea greeted him in the drawing-room. The servants were dismissed before they could overhear more than a low "nephew" and a "my lady," but it was enough to uncoil unease in Tessa's stomach. That night the servants' hall was tense. Edgar Pike leaned closer to the hearth than usual, his voice lower, eyes narrowed. "He's here to make changes," he muttered, speaking to no one in particular but loudly enough to be heard. "You can smell it on men like that. Silver cufflinks, city cologne, talk of investments." Millie, perched near the window, shifted uncomfortably. "Cook said he's thinking of cutting the grain ration for the stables." Tessa looked up. "He hasn't even walked the fields. How would he know what the land can bear?" Edgar turned, eyes sharp. "He doesn't need to know. That's the difference between a wren and a servant. He just decides. We just obey." A silence followed. It was not until the following afternoon that Tessa saw Nathaniel and Lionel together. She had been sent to the library to dust the lower shelves, a task requiring silence and attention to the order of the volumes. She moved slowly between the bookshelves, careful not to displace the old leather-bound tomes. The voices came through the half-open double doors. "Surely you see the need for efficiency," Lionel said, his voice bright and condescending. "Half these families pay in barley and stories. This estate bleeds nostalgia. It needs discipline." "And what it needs," Nathaniel replied, calm and unyielding, "is sustainability. Raise the rents and they'll fail. Dismiss the staff and the house will crumble from within." "Oh, come now," Lionel laughed. "Let us not pretend the house stands because of your little ledgers. You keep things tidy, I'll give you that, but there's more at stake than clean columns and annual reports." There was a pause. "You've never accepted it, have you?" Lionel continued, colder now. "You walk these halls in silence, wearing the black like a mourner at your own funeral, but none of it is truly yours. It's temporary, a delay." Nathaniel's voice dropped lower, "until the court decides otherwise." "It will," Lionel said, "sooner than you think." Tessa froze. Her breath stilled in her chest. The ledgers, the letter, the portrait. Her mind drew the lines between them faster than she could catch them. She reached blindly for the next volume, dustcloth trembling in her fingers. The voices receded as the gentlemen walked toward the western hall, but the chill they left behind lingered long after. Later that day, Lionel toured the estate with Lady Althea on his arm. From the upper windows, Tessa watched him gesture toward the fields with his cane, his head inclined toward her ladyship's bonnet, though it was clear he cared little for her responses. He moved with the ease of a man accustomed to having his suggestions obeyed before they were spoken. That evening, Nathaniel did not appear for supper in the servants' hall. Mrs. Pell explained he was reviewing estate accounts in private. No one questioned it, but Tessa felt the absence like a hollowness in the room. When she returned to the scullery to gather the silver trays for polishing, Millie approached her, small hands clutching her apron. "Miss Bramble," she whispered, "mind how you walk after dark. Mr. Pike's been skulking around the study at odd hours, and I heard him speaking to Mr. Lionel laughing together in the corridor." Tessa's heart tightened. Did they see you? I don't think so. But I know when a rat's found another. Tessa knelt, resting a gentle hand on Millie's shoulder. Thank you, but I'll be careful. That night, the corridors felt different. The manor, usually cloaked in a solemn peace once the lamps were extinguished, now seemed to bristle with invisible tension. Steps echoed sharper on the flagstones. Doors creaked more deliberately. The very walls appeared to lean in, listening. Tessa found herself drifting toward the east corridor, where the rain tapped softly at the window panes. She did not intend to seek him out, but her feet moved with a will of their own. When she reached the door to the butler's office, she paused. Inside, the fire had burned low, casting a warm glow across the wood-paneled walls. She did not knock, nor did she enter. But the door was open just enough for her to see Nathaniel seated at his desk, hands clasped before him. He was staring into the flames, unmoving. His posture was composed, as always, but his face was different. The lines around his mouth were drawn tight. His eyes were not iron now, but glass, clear and unreadable, as though he were holding back a tide no one else could see. And then he did something she had never seen him do. He exhaled, closed his eyes, and leaned forward, burying his face in his hands. It was the posture of a man who had fought too long, who had guarded too much, who had not yet lost, but feared, for the first time, that he might. Tessa stepped back without a sound, heart thrumming. The image stayed with her long into the night, long after she returned to her narrow bed. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her fingers curled against the wool blanket, listening to the house breathe around her. The tension she felt now had little to do with inheritance or estates or court disputes. It had everything to do with the man who bore the weight of them in silence, and with the quiet, terrifying realization that her loyalty was no longer rooted in duty. It had become something else entirely. The lantern room was never meant to hold the weight of confrontation. Nestled between the west wing and the lower pantry, it was a narrow, forgotten space, lined with glass panes, tin oil cans, and the soft scent of wax and kerosene. Tessa had entered it only to collect a replacement wick for the drawing-room sconces. The hour was late, and the manor was silent, its walls humming with the quiet of settled secrets. She was alone, until she wasn't. Edgar Pike stepped from the shadows, arms crossed, the faintest sneer curling at his lips. "Evening, Miss Bramble." Tessa froze. The lantern she carried flickered in her grip. "Mr. Pike," she said coolly, "you startled me." That was the intention. His tone was soft, but the softness had teeth. He took a slow step closer. "You've grown bold, haven't you? Walking the halls as if you owned them, whispering with the butler like you're mistress of the house." Tessa's jaw tightened. "I whisper to no one." "Oh, but you do," he said, circling the narrow space like a predator. "You think, because he looks at you a certain way, you're safe. But you're not, and neither is he." She set the lantern on a hook, forcing her voice into steadiness. "If you've something to say it plainly." He leaned in. "He's a fraud, and you know it." The words struck like a slap. Tessa stiffened, every nerve bristling. "You think I haven't seen the way he watches the ledgers? The way he walks through this house like a king in mourning?" Edgar hissed. "But his time is running out. Mr. Lionel means to expose him, and I, dear girl, intend to help. Now you will do the same." "I will do no such thing," Tessa said, her voice sharp and low. "You're meddling in matters you don't understand." "Oh, I understand plenty." He stepped closer. "You've been in the study. You've seen the letters. You know who he is, so don't pretend this is about honor. You're not protecting the truth. You're protecting a man." She opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. "I want his desk drawers searched. The lower cabinet holds the records. I've seen the key on his chain," Edgar continued. "If you help me, quietly, I'll see that you're rewarded. A place in the house, perhaps. No more scrubbing hearths." Tessa stared at him, her stomach twisting. "And if I don't?" she asked. His eyes darkened. Then don't be surprised if the entire household learns what kind of company you keep in the quiet hours. Rumors are easy to start, hard to stop. She slapped him. It was not loud, it did not echo, but it was final. Edgar's eyes widened, then narrowed. You'll regret that. She turned to leave, and in that precise moment his hand struck out, not in violence but in desperate spite. Shoving a lantern from the shelf behind her, it fell, glass shattered, oil splashed, flame bloomed. The room erupted, fire leapt from wick to wall, igniting the dry wood in a flash. Smoke rose in thick waves. Tessa screamed as heat seared the hem of her skirt. Edgar cursed and stumbled backward, already coughing. She dropped to her knees, grasping at the burning cloth, slapping it out with frantic hands. Her lungs screamed for air, her eyes burned. Somewhere behind her, Edgar fled. And then, through the choking smoke, came a voice. "Tessa!" Nathaniel's figure emerged in the doorway, outlined by the blaze. She reached for him blindly. "The fire! It's caught! Edgar! He didn't ask. He pulled her up, shielding her with his body, and dragged her from the room. But before they reached the hall, Tessa saw him pause. The box of ledgers sat on the edge of the flame, its leather skin beginning to curl. "No!" she gasped. He let go of her. "Nathaniel, don't!" But he was already gone. He plunged into the fire, coat thrown over his face, disappearing into the smoke. Seconds passed like years. Then he re-emerged, arms wrapped around the blackened box, his sleeves smouldering. He stumbled, coughed, and collapsed. Tessa ran to him. Servants poured into the corridor, buckets, cloths, shouts. The fire was beaten back with desperate hands and a flood of water from the cistern. But Nathaniel did not rise. He was carried, unconscious, to the butler's chambers, ironically the only room with a bed large enough and quiet enough to keep him from the chaos. Tessa sat beside him. His face was pale, smeared with ash. His breath came shallow. The box of ledgers rested near the hearth, its lid warped but intact. The physician arrived. Compresses were applied. Laudanum offered. Lady Althea appeared once, eyes wide with something like dread, and said nothing. Then she turned to Mrs. Pell and said the words aloud. "Bring me the letter, the one from his mother." Mrs. Pell hesitated, then nodded. They knew. Later, when the room had emptied, Tessa remained. Her dress was still damp, her hands blistered, but she refused to leave. Nathaniel stirred only once, whispering something between dream and delirium. Foxcombe, the summer fields, Sophia. Names she did not know, places that did not belong to a butler. Only once did his voice break. I tried to be enough." Tessa's heart clenched. She reached forward, brushing the damp hair from his brow, her touch feather-light. "I know who you are," she whispered. Her voice shook, but not with fear. "I've known, longer than I dared admit. And I won't run from it. Or from you." He did not wake, but the lines of his face softened, as if her voice had reached somewhere he could still feel. When dawn broke, pale and quiet, the smoke from the fire had long since cleared. The house stood intact. The ledgers were safe, and the truth, no longer silent, had found its way into the open. Nathaniel opened his eyes late in the morning. Tessa was there, seated beside him. For a long moment, they looked at one another. No roles, no silence, no pretense. He spoke first. "I imagine you have questions. Only if you have strength enough to answer." He nodded once. "My name is Nathaniel Harrow Wren, the son of Charles Wren and Helena Harrow, born legitimate, conceived inconveniently." Tessa waited. "My stepfather, Reginald Ashcombe, forged documents, claimed my mother bore me before marriage. After her death, he had me cast out and declared unfit to inherit. He thought if I vanished, no one would challenge the claim." He exhaled, but I returned, quietly, with proof. "I took my place here not as master, but as servant, to rebuild, to observe, to protect the estate until the law could restore my name." "And the fire?" she asked. His lips curved faintly. "Was not part of the plan." They both almost laughed, but instead he reached for her hand. "I owe you more than gratitude," he said. "I owe you truth, and I give it freely now." She looked down at their joined hands. "Then let that be enough, for now." And in the stillness that followed, no further words were needed. The morning Nathaniel Harrow Wren reclaimed his name, Wrenwood Hall stood still. The bell rang at the usual hour. Boots were shined, breakfast trays prepared, the linen folded into crisp thirds. But an air of expectancy hung over every corner of the house, taut and waiting, like the hush before a verdict is read. Even the dust motes in the high halls seemed suspended, as if unwilling to settle before the truth had landed. By 8 o'clock, all staff were summoned to the great vestibule, a place usually reserved for grand arrivals or grim farewells. No one explained why. No reason was given, but the message passed like a shiver through the servants' hall. "Mr. Ward has called us." And so they came. Mrs. Pell stood at the edge of the stairs, her keys silent for once. Milly clung to Tessa's side, eyes wide, whispering nothing. Edgar loitered at the front, smug and expectant, arms crossed. And from the gallery above, Lady Althea appeared in full morning black, her expression unreadable. Then Nathaniel entered. He wore no gloves, no tailcoat, only a dark wool frock and an open collar, simple, undecorated, unmistakably noble. He moved with the same grace they had always known, but now he did not carry the posture of a servant masking command. He was command. When he stopped before them, he looked at each face in turn, not with superiority, but with gravity, as if he had carried their faces in his memory long before he stood before them as their equal in title. "I was born Nathaniel Harrow Wren," he began, "the legitimate son of Charles Wren, Master of Wrenwood, and Helena Harrow, his lawful wife. I was raised here, educated abroad, and cast aside at 20 by the man who married my mother after my father's death. That man, Reginald Ashcombe, declared me illegitimate. He falsified documents, bribed witnesses, and had me erased." The silence deepened. Even the wind beyond the windows ceased its movement. "I returned to Wrenwood not to reclaim it in noise or pride, but in silence. I returned as a butler, so I might learn what had become of the land, the people, and the house that bore my name. I returned to protect it if I could, until the law saw fit to hear me." His eyes settled on Lionel, who stood behind the assembly with one brow arched and a gloved hand resting arrogantly on his cane. "The law has begun to listen," Nathaniel continued, "and now you must listen too. I am no longer Mr. Ward. I am your rightful master. Whether you accept that title or not is yours to decide. But I will not lie to you again." The hush was broken only by the shift of shoes against polished stone. Mrs. Pell stepped forward first. She gave a sharp nod, unsentimental but firm. "We've always known the heart of this house, sir, name or no name." Milly curtsied, her eyes brimming. A footman lowered his gaze and nodded, but not all followed. Edgar stepped forward, voice sharp. "You speak of truth, yet you've worn a lie for years. You deceived every man and woman in this house. Every one of us trusted you, and you stood above us in disguise." Nathaniel met his gaze evenly. "I never stood above you, Mr. Pike. I stood beside you. That is what you resent." A flush crept up Edgar's neck. "You should be ashamed." "It is not shame that weighs on me," Nathaniel replied quietly, "but the cost of silence." Then Lionel stepped forward, clapping slowly. The sound rang hollow. "Charming, truly, a performance worthy of the theatre." He turned to Lady Althea. "Surely, Aunt, you don't intend to endorse this melodrama?" Lady Althea raised her chin. "I have read the letters, seen the papers, and spoken to my late husband's solicitor. What stands before us is not a butler. It is my nephew by marriage. The rightful heir." Lionel's voice dropped to a low hiss. "He will never hold it. I will challenge the claim, through every court in England if I must." "You are welcome to try," Nathaniel answered, his voice calm, though the faintest strain touched the edge of it. Tessa had not spoken. She could not. She stood rooted to the back of the assembly, her hands clasped tight behind her. Her gaze fixed on Nathaniel, now Nathaniel Harrow Wren, her heart beating not with pride or admiration, but with something that felt strangely like grief. Because she could not reach him now. Not truly. She had seen him vulnerable, broken, soot-stained, and bleeding. She had known his voice in the dark, but now he stood beyond her, on the steps, above the household, claiming his place, and something inside her whispered that she no longer belonged. That night, she did not sleep. The moonlight spilled through the attic dormer, casting a pale shimmer across the worn wooden floor. Her satchel lay open on the bed. A spare dress, a book of psalms, her mother's thimble. She packed each item in silence. Millie stirred in the next cot. "Tessa," she mumbled sleepily. "I'm only folding." Tessa lied. She couldn't stay. She had once believed that love, even quiet love, could grow anywhere. In kitchens, in still rooms, between glances and unspoken truths. But love could not breathe when trapped between servants' lace and noble inheritance. Not in this house, not in this world. Elsewhere, beyond the grand staircase, Nathaniel sat alone in the study. The fire crackled low. Shadows danced against the bookshelves. Before him, on the desk, lay a letter, a copy of the one Reginald Ashcombe had read aloud before the trustees when Nathaniel was just 20. "The boy is not legitimate, born out of wedlock. I have here a sworn affidavit and a birth record from the parish that will confirm it." He remembered the way his stepfather's voice rang with certainty, the way no one questioned him. He remembered the silence that followed, the carriage that took him away, the look of his mother, already ill, unable to speak, tears running down her cheeks in mute apology. He had never been able to forget that silence. He pressed his fingers to his temple, the memory pulsing behind his eyes. So many years lost. So much effort spent proving what should never have been denied. He had become his own shadow. And now, as he sat in the room where his father once read aloud by candlelight, he felt the ache of exile return, not in body, but in soul. The door creaked softly. Tessa stood just beyond the threshold, dressed in her cloak, her satchel in hand. She said nothing. He rose slowly. "You're leaving," he said, though it was not a question. She nodded once. "I don't belong in a house where I must bow to the man I—" She stopped, but the word hovered in the air between them. His eyes searched hers. "Nothing has changed. Everything has," she whispered. "I'm still the man who carried you from the fire. And now you are the man who owns the house that holds me in service." Pain flickered in his gaze. "I never meant to make you small. You didn't. The world will." She stepped back. He didn't stop her. But as she walked away, he turned to the hearth and with a single trembling breath dropped the forged affidavit into the flames. The fire consumed it swiftly, but it did not burn the ache from his chest, nor the echo of footsteps fading into the corridor beyond. The day broke grey and still, as though the very skies held their breath. A hush settled over Wrenwood Hall, not from sleep or peace, but from anticipation, a kind of reverent silence that precedes storm or judgment. For the first time in nearly a decade, the great oak doors of the drawing room were opened for official proceedings. The hearths burned low, casting long shadows along the panelled walls. Chairs had been arranged in a semicircle before the bay window, where once, long ago, Charles Wren had received tenants and dignitaries alike. Now it would host a reckoning. The rector from Wrenfield Parish arrived first, his black robes dusted with early frost. Next came Mr. Percival Ashe, the estate's land agent, his face drawn tight beneath his bowler hat. Behind him, Lady Althea descended the staircase with her usual grace, but her gloved hands trembled as they clutched the banister. And Nathaniel, no longer Mr. Ward, but Nathaniel Harrow Wren, stood at the head of the room. He wore no cravat, no signet ring, no outward symbol of aristocracy, only a dark coat and his own name, worn now without shame. Tessa was not among them. She had vanished at dawn. The only trace she left behind was her folded apron, laid gently on the bench beside the still-room door, and a small jar of blackberry jam placed with quiet care on the windowsill of the kitchen. The same jam she had once entered in the village fair. He had found it just before the hearing. His hand had rested on the glass lid longer than necessary, and though his jaw remained set, his eyes betrayed the hollow that had begun to form inside him. By 9 o'clock, the formal inquiry commenced. Lionel Wren arrived last, accompanied by a solicitor from London and the ever-smirking Edgar Pike, who lingered in the corner like a crow awaiting carrion. Lionel did not bow to Lady Althea. He did not greet the rector. He simply announced in his smooth and practiced voice that he was prepared to prove Mr. Ward, pardon Mr. Harrow Wren, a usurper. Nathaniel stood tall, silent, still. The rector spoke first. I officiated the marriage between Charles Wren and Helena Harrow on the 2nd of March, 1829. I baptized their son Nathaniel the following year. I kept the original parish record, which I have here. He passed the worn register to the table. Mr. Ashe followed. I began managing the estate for Lady Althea in the year following Mr. Charles's passing. In my possession, I hold signed correspondence from Mr. Charles acknowledging Nathaniel as his son and heir. All legal, all dated, all unaltered. Lionel barely blinked. Fabrications, he said, all of it conveniently discovered. Then Lady Althea stepped forward. I knew Helena Harrow, she said, her voice steady. I knew her honour. I knew her heart. And I knew the cruelty of the man she married after Charles died. My husband confided in me before his passing. He feared for his son. That fear proved justified. Her gaze pierced Lionel, and for the first time he flinched. Then came Mrs. Pell. She walked slowly, carefully, her step deliberate as though each one echoed more than the last. In her hand she carried a sealed envelope, yellowed with age, tied in violet ribbon. This letter, she said, was entrusted to me by Mrs. Helena Wren when she was dying. She made me swear never to give it unless Nathaniel's name was defamed again. She held it out to the solicitor. Inside is her written account, the dates of her marriage, her son's birth, the identity of the man who orchestrated the fraud against him. It bears her signature, witnessed and recorded. The room went still. Lionel's solicitor cleared his throat, glancing nervously at the letter. This evidence must be reviewed. Please do, Nathaniel said quietly, but Lionel's calm cracked. What of her? He spat suddenly, pointing toward the empty seat Tessa had once occupied. The maid. The girl who warmed your bed while you wore a servant's mask. How convenient that she's vanished. She seduced the butler, believing him powerless, and now clings to a future built on deception. Should that not be considered? There was a hush. Nathaniel's face remained still, but a flicker of pain crossed his eyes. That girl, he said slowly, risked her life for this house. She fed it, cleaned it, defended it. She did what you, in all your titles, never dared. She loved it. Lionel sneered. Romantic nonsense. And if you won't see it, perhaps others will. He turned to Edgar Pike. Tell them what you found. Edgar stepped forward, waving a folder with dramatic flair. Forged records, he said. Letters written by Nathaniel to a fictitious solicitor. I discovered them in the lower study. They prove intent to deceive. Nathaniel did not move. There are no forged letters in that file, he said evenly. Because that folder belonged to your father, Edgar. It holds rent rolls and eviction notices. Ones he hid from the steward. Lies! Edgar barked, but his voice cracked. Then from the corner of the room another voice spoke. No, sir, they're not lies. All eyes turned. Millie stood near the door, pale and shaking, but firm. In her small hands she held a bundle wrapped in cloth. I found this under Mr. Pike's cot, she said. It's the ledger from the night of the fire, the one he said burned. But it didn't. He tried to destroy it, but he failed. She unwrapped it. The book was blackened at the corners, but whole. Inside, pages detailed land agreements, falsified figures and names. One name repeated, Pike. The solicitor took the ledger, scanning it with mounting dread. Edgar turned to Lionel, panic rising. "He told me," he said. "Enough!" Lionel snapped, but it was too late. The solicitor stepped back, clearing his throat. "It appears, sir, that the case for contesting Mr. Harrow Wren's inheritance is unsustainable." Lionel's composure collapsed. "You think this ends here?" he hissed. "You think you've won?" He turned on his heel, storming from the hall, Edgar scrambling after him like a dog denied a bone. In the silence that followed, Nathaniel remained motionless. It was only when the rector gently said, "It is done," that he breathed again. The others began to disperse, Lady Althea touching his shoulder with quiet pride, Mrs. Pell nodding once, her eyes suspiciously damp. But Nathaniel did not celebrate. He walked through the halls slowly, searching. Her room was empty, the cot stripped, the scent of rosemary still lingered in the air. Downstairs, he found her apron folded with care beside the still-room bench. On the windowsill sat the jar of jam, the deep purple fruit preserved beneath the wax seal. He picked it up gently, and for the first time since childhood, Nathaniel Harrow Wren felt what it was to win, and be utterly alone. The first breath of spring arrived in Wrenwood, not with fanfare, but with quiet insistence. After a winter thick with ash and silence, the land began to stir again, modestly at first. Snowmelt carved slender rivers through the fields, soaking into the earth as if asking permission to nourish it once more. Buds pushed gently against the branches of apple trees, and daffodils dared to bloom at the edge of the drive. Smoke curled once again from the manor's chimneys, thin, silvery wisps that danced like promises above newly cleaned rooftops. Children's laughter echoed from the converted stable where Lady Althea had opened a small school, its walls papered with verses and chalk drawings, each one a tribute to the girl who had once knelt to scrub Wrenwood's floors and now had her name spoken with reverence. The estate breathed again, and yet its master moved through it like a ghost. Nathaniel Harrow Wren walked the gravel paths in silence, coat unbuttoned despite the chill, hair unruly beneath the brim of his hat. The ribbons and formal wear of inheritance had been folded away in a drawer he never opened. In their place, he wore dark wool and scuffed boots, the garments of a man still bound to the soil. Every morning he passed the chapel, the still room, the garden's edge. He greeted the smith, the tenant farmers, the bakers kneading fresh loaves. They bowed now, respectfully, not as servants but as neighbours. Yet none of their gestures touched the ache that lived behind his ribs. He had not spoken her name aloud since the day he found the jar of blackberry jam and her apron folded on the bench like a farewell kiss. He had held that fabric in his hands for long minutes, as though it might still carry her warmth. But it had only carried absence. The orchard was beginning to awaken. Rows of young apple trees stretched toward a pale blue sky, their bare limbs dusted with the softest hints of green. The earth was wet, but no longer frozen, and the sweet smell of soil mingled with the clean perfume of sunlit bark. Nathaniel paused at the edge of the eastern grove, the place where the bramble land had once begun. His gaze swept the slope, half expecting it to be as empty as his arms. But she was there. Kneeling in the dirt, her back curved like a question mark over a row of rose cuttings, was Tessa. She wore a dress of soft grey cotton, hem stained with soil, sleeves rolled up to the elbows. A battered straw hat shielded her face, but the curve of her cheek was unmistakable. The breeze caught a tendril of auburn hair, pulling it free to curl near her jaw. Her hands were ungloved, her fingers dark with the work of planting. She moved slowly with care and purpose, as if each stem held more than thorns, perhaps a memory, perhaps a prayer. Nathaniel did not breathe. His boots crunched against the gravel, and she looked up. Her eyes met his, not startled, not unsure, but steady. The same green that had once challenged him in the scullery now regarded him from the open air, grounded, rooted, defiant in her quiet dignity. He removed his hat. "I thought—" His voice broke and he paused to gather it. "I thought you were gone for good." "I was," she said simply, "but not for long." He stepped closer, the sun catching the fine dust on his shoulders. She wiped her hands on her skirt, not to make herself more presentable, but merely out of habit. "This is a tenant plot now," she said. "I asked Lady Althea for a strip of land just at the edge. She agreed. I returned yesterday. No one noticed." "I noticed," he said. "Everything felt quieter. I didn't come back to be noticed." She glanced back at the roses, adjusting a stem that leaned too far left. "I came to plant what was mine, on my terms." Nathaniel nodded. He knelt beside her, boots pressing into the earth, coat gathering mud at the hem. "I did not come to make you a lady," he said softly. "I have no need for titles in this place. I only ask—" His voice trembled slightly, more from emotion than cold. "I ask that you walk beside me, as you are." Tessa looked at him, truly looked. The lines at the corners of his eyes were deeper now. He had not shaved in days, but there was a gentleness in the way he crouched in the dirt beside her, a reverence that had never been spoken, but had always lived in his gaze. Her hand reached out, fingers trembling only slightly as they slid across the soil and into his. Rough palms met rough palms, the same calluses, the same scars. "I never needed to be rescued," she said at last. "Only seen." "You were," he whispered, "from the first." A gust of wind rustled through the orchard, stirring the branches like applause. Far off, a bell from the village tolled noon. But here, in the damp earth and between thorns and shoots, time held its breath. They did not kiss. There was no dramatic embrace, no flurry of violins or declarations. Only two hands clasped, two souls planted in the same soil. And in that quiet, something bloomed. Not the rose, not the orchard, but them. The morning of the wedding dawned soft and pale, like linen left to dry in a spring breeze. Mist clung to the hills and nestled gently between the hedgerows, as if the earth itself wished to keep this day wrapped in reverence. At Wrenwood Hall there was no frenzy, only a quiet, trembling anticipation that stirred behind every window pane and rustled through the blossom-laden branches of the orchard. The chapel, small and ancient, stood just beyond the walled garden. Its stone walls were covered in moss. Its stained glass windows glowed faintly with morning light. Inside, benches had been polished to a gleam. The aisle was strewn with petals gathered by village children, their fingers stained with the memory of roses and violets. Candles flickered in every alcove, their golden flames dancing to the hushed murmur of waiting hearts. No carriages lined the drive. There was no parade of aristocrats. Instead, they came on foot, farmers with worn boots and fresh waistcoats, housemaids with aprons pressed smooth, elders leaning on walking sticks carved by their grandchildren. They came because they had known the girl who once carried buckets across the yard, and the man who had once stood in silence with a ledger in hand, hiding his name like a wound. Lady Althea was the first to rise when the bride entered. She stood at the chapel's threshold in a gown of pale lavender silk, not as mistress of the manor, but as kin. Her hands, delicate with age, reached out and gently lifted the veil that concealed Tessa's face. There was a hush, so complete it seemed the chapel itself held its breath. Tessa wore no jewels. Her gown was simple, the colour of cream poured into tea, with long sleeves and a row of tiny buttons down the back. A narrow ribbon, green as the orchard's new leaves, tied at her waist. Her hair had been swept into a modest coil at the nape of her neck, with a single wildflower pinned just above her ear. She did not blush. She did not tremble. She walked forward, with her eyes fixed ahead, steady as a flame protected from the wind. At the altar stood Nathaniel, dressed not in the finery of a lord, but in a black suit tailored with grace and restraint. His cravat was grey, his boots freshly brushed but plain. No rings glittered, no medallions gleamed. He was not there to impress. He was there to vow. As she reached him, he extended his hand, not to claim, not to possess, but to welcome. The rector began the service, but his words faded into the soft light that poured through the windows, into the rustling of branches just beyond the walls. What remained, what resonated, were the words spoken by them alone. Nathaniel took her hand in both of his. "To love you," he said, his voice thick with quiet emotion. "Not above, nor below, but beside." Tessa's lips parted, her voice a whisper wrapped in certainty. "To build a home," she said, "not just a house." A breath passed through the chapel, like wind before rain. And then Mrs. Pell, seated in the front row with her hat askew and handkerchief shaking, wept openly. The villagers smiled, some clutched hands. A child giggled, and Lady Althea closed her eyes as if giving thanks to a grace long awaited. The bells tolled not for duty, nor death, but for joy. For once, Wrenwood's chimes carried only celebration, not summons. Outside, the feast awaited beneath the great orchard trees, now in full bloom. Long wooden tables were draped in linen, laden with roast meats, fresh bread, spring greens, honeyed tarts, and elderflower wine. Bunting fluttered from branch to branch, tied by the same maids who had scrubbed pots the day before. Children wove between the guests, scattering petals with wild delight, some tossing them straight into the air with gleeful abandon. No one was turned away. Every tenant, every stable boy, every laundress, every schoolchild had a place. Nathaniel moved among them, not as master, but as neighbor. He accepted blessings from old women with bent backs and laughter from young boys with dirty hands. Tessa sat on a low bench beneath the largest apple tree, her shoes kicked off beneath the table, a slice of plum cake half-eaten in her hand. Her veil hung over a chair. Her cheeks were flushed with sun and satisfaction. Milly placed a crown of daisies on her head, crooked and cheerful. Tessa let it remain. There were no formal speeches, but when the sun began to lower and the sky burned with amber light, the crowd quieted as Nathaniel extended his hand once more. "Shall we walk?" he asked. She nodded, setting her cake aside. They slipped away from the crowd, unnoticed at first, then watched with fond, knowing smiles by those who had come to love them both. Up the hill they climbed side by side until the manor stood small behind them and the ridge opened wide before them, the place where Bramble Farm once stood. The fields were green now, dotted with sheep and wild daisies. The ruins of the cottage had long since been cleared, but the path to it remained. Nathaniel stopped near the oak tree, where a swing had once hung. Tessa stepped close. He said nothing. She rested her head on his shoulder. Below them, the bell rang once more, its echo rising through the valley like a hymn. Tessa's eyes closed, her body leaning into his with quiet trust. She had been scrub girl, tenant's daughter, outcast. He had been butler, outlier, ghost of an inheritance denied. But now, the girl who once knelt by hearthstones walked upright in the full light of day. And the man who once stood in shadows was finally seen. 8 years had passed since the bells last rang in Wrenwood for joy. Now they rang to mark the hour of evensong, as they always had, their tones softer with time, familiar as a lullaby. Autumn had settled gently over the valley, golden leaves rustled through the hedgerows, and the air carried that faint, sweet scent of chimney smoke and ripe apples. Wrenwood Hall stood unchanged in its bones, but softened by life. The great stone facade was no longer a fortress of formality, but a home. Windows were often left ajar, letting in the laughter of children. The east wing, once silent and shuttered, had become a schoolroom and a refuge for orphaned girls from the village. And in the still room, where once secrets had passed like whispers through the air, dried lavender hung in bundles tied with ribbon, and hands small and large stirred pots of jam. Tessa Harrow Wren stood at the orchard fence, her shawl pulled around her shoulders, the wind catching at her dark auburn hair now streaked with early silver. In her hands she held a notebook, pages filled with drawings of seedlings, planting notes, and the soft looping script of a life rooted in care. From behind her, small boots thudded across the path. "Mama!" cried a voice, breathless and bright. Little Evan, their youngest at 4, came bounding toward her, cheeks flushed from the chill. Behind him walked his sister Clara, now 7, serene and sharp-eyed, carrying a basket of windfall pears. Tessa knelt to embrace them, holding them close, as if the years could be kept at bay by the press of small arms around her neck. "Have you thanked the trees today?" she whispered. Clara nodded solemnly. "We left the last pear for the robin." Evan grinned. "He tried to take 2. Tessa laughed, a sound fuller, warmer than it once had been. Motherhood had softened her, yes, but had also emboldened her. No longer the girl who'd walked alone to a manor that did not want her. She had become its heart. Nathaniel watched from the terrace above, a cup of tea cooling in his hand. His hair had greyed at the temples, and lines marked his face from years of labour, of joy, of worry. But in his eyes, nothing had dimmed. They still lit when she entered a room, still softened when their children spoke his name. He walked down the steps slowly, his limp a quiet reminder of the fire he'd once braved, of the body that had broken to protect what mattered most. No one spoke of it now, but it lingered in the way he reached for railings, or in the pause before lifting a heavy book. He kissed Tessa's forehead and lifted Evan into his arms. "The orchard's ready," he said softly. "We could plant tomorrow." She smiled. "It's always ready, and so are we." In the village, the world had changed as well. Lady Althea had passed 3 winters ago, her final letter to Tessa sealed with a sprig of rosemary and the words, "May you always protect what you've planted." The school she had founded now bore her name and Tessa's stewardship. Mrs. Pell, half-blind and fiercely proud, still ruled the kitchens, though now she barked orders from a cushioned chair with a warm stone at her feet. Edgar Pike had vanished the morning after the inheritance hearing. No one looked for him, and no one spoke of him. Rumours said he'd gone abroad, others whispered darker endings. But Wrenwood had no room for his shadow anymore. As for Lionel Wren, justice had found him slowly, but inevitably. Years of debt, of failed ventures, of scandal. He died far from Yorkshire, stripped of title, his final days spent in quiet disgrace. His name was no longer spoken at Wrenwood, but Nathaniel's was. Lord Harrow Wren, as he was titled by law, had declined every invitation to London, every summons to sit on the magistrate's bench. He remained simply Mr. Ward to the village. Honoured, yes, but never aloof. He taught apprentices to manage the estate, oversaw repairs with his sleeves rolled, and spent long hours in the library, writing letters in support of land reform and fair tenant protections. He never again wore the ring that once symbolized Wrenwood's claim. Instead, he wore the simpler one Tessa gave him, fashioned from the handle of a broken kitchen spoon, engraved inside with the words, "To walk beside." Each autumn, on the anniversary of their wedding, the tenants held a quiet feast beneath the trees. Not out of obligation, but devotion. Lanterns were lit, songs were sung, and blackberry jam, Tessa's recipe, was spread thick on fresh bread. This year Clara would sing for the first time, her voice as clear as bells. As twilight fell, Tessa and Nathaniel stood once more at the ridge, Evan nestled against his father's chest, Clara at her mother's side. The fields below stretched golden and endless, the sky painted with violet dusk. "I never imagined this," Tessa murmured. "I did," Nathaniel said. "Not the titles, not the land. Just this." She turned to him, eyes full of light and time. "Does it feel like enough?" He smiled, gently brushing wind-blown hair from her cheek. "It feels like everything." And in that moment, with the wind carrying the laughter of their children and the scent of autumn fruit ripening below, the world stood still, held by the hands of 2 people who had once faced it with nothing but pride, silence, and the flicker of impossible hope. Their love had not only endured, it had bloomed. Every story leaves a trace. And Tessa's journey, from barefoot farm girl to the heart of Wrenwood Hall, is not just a tale of love, but of courage, dignity, and the quiet power of standing tall, even when the world tries to bend you. Perhaps, like Tessa, you too have felt unseen. Perhaps you've loved someone in silence, or maybe you've had to choose dignity over comfort, truth over convenience. This story reminds us that even in the darkest corridors of fate, there are hands waiting to reach for ours, if we dare to hope. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments. We'd love to know what moment touched you most. And if you made it all the way here, to this final walk in the orchard, to this final kiss of light over Wrenwood, write the word blossom in the comments below. It will be our secret sign that you carried this love until the very last page. If you feel called to support the team that brings these timeless romances to life, you're warmly invited to click Super Thanks and contribute with whatever amount feels right for you. It helps us continue creating more of these emotional journeys, crafted with love and care. But if you can't support us that way right now, know this: simply sharing this story with a friend, a sister, or someone who still believes in love is already a beautiful act of kindness. And if you want more stories like this, rich with drama, secrets, and slow-burning emotion, don't forget to watch the other narratives I've left for you in the cards at the top of the screen. Each one has a heartbeat of its own. Thank you for walking this path with Tessa and Nathaniel. May we all have the courage to love not above, not below, but beside.